Welcome, fellow wanderer of the four nations, to the deepest mysteries that linger in the shadows of the Avatar world. Tonight, we venture beyond the chronicles of heroes and villains into the realm of unanswered questions that have haunted fans for years. These are the secrets that whisper in temple halls, the riddles that dance in spirit winds, and the enigmas that even the wisest sages cannot fully explain. So settle into comfort. Let your mind drift like morning mist over mountain peaks, and join us as we explore the beautiful mysteries that make this world eternally fascinating and forever alive with possibility. The question that strikes at the very heart of what it means to be the Avatar has puzzled spiritual scholars and casual observers alike since the first moment we witnessed the bridge between worlds in action. When the great light spirit Rava merged with One during that first harmonic convergence 10,000 years ago, she created something unprecedented in the history of both human and spirit realms. A conscious being capable of reincarnation while maintaining connection to accumulated wisdom spanning multiple lifetimes. But the mechanisms behind this miraculous cycle remain shrouded in mystery deeper than the ocean trenches where ancient spirits slumber. The traditional understanding speaks of reincarnation, the eternal return of a single soul clothed in different flesh across the centuries, carrying forward the essential identity that makes each avatar simultaneously individual and eternal. Yet careful examination of how the avatar cycle actually manifests reveals complexities that challenge this simple explanation, suggesting that what transfers from one incarnation to the next might be something far more nuanced than complete spiritual continuity, something that exists in the liminal space between preservation and transformation. When Avatar Korra's connection to her past lives was severed by Unalaq's assault on Rava herself, the implications were staggering, not merely for their immediate tactical disadvantages, but for what they revealed about the nature of Avatar consciousness. The ease with which these connections could be broken suggested that they were not fundamental aspects of an eternal soul, but rather something more akin to spiritual memories stored within Rava's cosmic essence, accessible to each avatar, but not intrinsically part of their individual identity. The evidence for this interpretation becomes more compelling when we consider how past avatar personalities manifest during moments of spiritual communion. Avatar Roku's appearances to Aang carried the weight of genuine personality, complete with emotional responses that seemed authentically continuous with his living self. Yet these encounters occurred within spiritual contexts that emphasized communication rather than true merger of consciousness. The avatar state itself, while channeling the combined power and knowledge of all previous incarnations, appeared to operate more like accessing a vast library than becoming temporarily possessed by ancestral spirits. The distinction becomes crucial when examining instances where the boundaries between individual and collective avatar consciousness become blurred or challenged. During Aang's journey through the crystal catacombs of Ba Sing Se, his ability to commune with Avatar Roku revealed not just memories or recorded experiences, but what seemed to be ongoing spiritual awareness that transcended death. Yet this same Roku appeared to exist independently within the spirit world, suggesting that what remains after an avatar's death might be more complex than simple dissolution into collective memory. Tenzin's encounter with Aang's spirit within the fog of lost souls presents perhaps the most compelling evidence that avatar consciousness involves something more than just Rava's accumulated memories. The Aang who appeared to his son carried not just knowledge of his earthly life, but active concern for Tenzin's immediate spiritual crisis, demonstrating awareness and responsiveness that pure memory could not provide. This interaction suggested that some essential aspect of avatar identity persists in spiritual form, maintaining individual agency even while contributing to the collective wisdom available to future incarnations. But if individual avatar spirits maintain independent existence after death, then what exactly is reincarnated when a new avatar is born? The physical manifestation of avatar power suggests that something tangible transfers between incarnations, something more substantial than mere access to ancestral wisdom. The distinctive markings that appear during the avatar state, identical across different incarnations, point toward continuity that transcends cultural or individual variation, indicating that avatar identity involves elements that remain consistent regardless of the specific person who serves as host. The spiritual mechanics become even more mysterious when considering how avatar abilities manifest in newborns who have not yet developed sufficient consciousness to access complex spiritual states deliberately. Korra's early demonstration of bending multiple elements suggested that avatar potential exists as an inherent spiritual configuration rather than learned skill, implying that whatever transfers between incarnations includes fundamental alterations to spiritual architecture that enable capabilities impossible for normal human consciousness. The relationship between Rava and her avatar hosts further complicates traditional reincarnation models. When Unalaq extracted Rava from Korra, the light spirit retained her distinct personality and memories while becoming temporarily separated from her human partner. This separation demonstrated that Rava's consciousness remains independently coherent, suggesting that avatar incarnation might function more like spiritual symbiosis than true merger, with human and spirit maintaining separate identities while sharing unified purpose and combined capabilities. Yet the depth of connection between Rava and her hosts clearly exceeds simple partnership. The avatar state represents not just cooperation between distinct entities, but genuine fusion of consciousness that enables access to cosmic perspectives impossible for either human or spirit alone. This fusion appears to create something genuinely new rather than merely combining existing elements, suggesting that avatar incarnation involves transformation of both partners into something that transcends their individual limitations while preserving their essential characteristics. The question of memory preservation across incarnations reveals additional layers of complexity in how avatar consciousness operates. While each avatar can access knowledge and experiences from previous lives, these memories appear filtered through their individual personality and cultural context rather than being experienced as foreign implants. Aang's connection to Avatar Roku felt natural and comfortable, despite the vast differences in their historical circumstances, suggesting that Avatar memory functions more like inherited wisdom than imposed recollection. The selective nature of Avatar memory access also implies sophisticated spiritual mechanisms that determine which experiences and knowledge remain available across incarnations. Traumatic or deeply personal memories seem less likely to transfer completely, while wisdom related to avatar duties and spiritual insights appears more readily accessible. This suggests that what Rava preserves and transmits might be curated rather than comprehensive, shaped by judgments about what future incarnations will need to fulfill their cosmic responsibilities effectively. The Avatar's unique relationship with the spirit world provides additional clues about the nature of incarnated consciousness. Each Avatar demonstrates instinctive comfort with spiritual concepts and abilities that normal humans must study extensively to develop, suggesting that Avatar incarnation includes spiritual preparation that transcends ordinary educational processes. This preparation appears to operate at levels too deep for conscious awareness, manifesting as intuitive understanding rather than explicit knowledge. The phenomenon becomes more intriguing when considering how different avatars interpret and apply their inherited wisdom according to their individual personalities and cultural backgrounds. Kyoshi's decisive approach to justice differed dramatically from Aang's emphasis on mercy, yet both drew upon the same accumulated Avatar knowledge to support their contrasting philosophies. This suggests that Avatar wisdom transfers as principles rather than specific instructions, allowing each incarnation to adapt eternal truths to contemporary circumstances through their unique perspective and judgment. The possibility that Avatar reincarnation operates through multiple simultaneous mechanisms offers perhaps the most satisfying explanation for these apparent contradictions. Individual Avatar spirits might maintain independent existence in the spirit world, while also contributing essential aspects of their identity to Rava's preserved memories, which then influence the spiritual configuration of subsequent incarnations without completely determining their personality or approach to Avatar duties. Under this model, Avatar reincarnation would involve genuine spiritual continuity maintained through Rava's eternal presence, individual consciousness that persists after death to provide guidance and support, and accumulated wisdom that shapes each new incarnation's intuitive understanding of their cosmic role. The Avatar cycle would thus represent not simple reincarnation, but rather a complex spiritual ecosystem where past, present, and future Avatar identities coexist and collaborate across the boundaries between life and death, physical and spiritual realms. The implications of such a system extend far beyond academic interest in spiritual mechanics to encompass fundamental questions about identity, continuity, and the nature of consciousness itself. If Avatar incarnation demonstrates that individual awareness can persist after death while simultaneously contributing to ongoing spiritual evolution, then it challenges conventional understanding of what it means to be human and what possibilities might exist for consciousness beyond the limitations of physical existence. The mystery deepens when considering how the Avatar cycle might continue to evolve as it encounters new challenges and incorporates experiences that previous incarnations never faced. Each Avatar adds their unique perspective and hard-won wisdom to the collective inheritance available to future incarnations, suggesting that Avatar consciousness grows and develops, rather than simply repeating established patterns across centuries of service to balance and harmony. As we drift deeper into contemplation of these spiritual mysteries, perhaps the most profound realization is that the question of what transfers between Avatar incarnations may be less important than what remains constant. The eternal commitment to serving as bridge between worlds, the unwavering dedication to preserving balance and protecting life, and the infinite capacity for growth and adaptation that enables each Avatar to meet their generation's unique challenges while drawing strength from accumulated wisdom, spanning millennia of service to the eternal dance between all-bade, spiritual, and physical realms. The mystery that shrouds Iroh's transformation from ruthless general to beloved uncle begins with dragons soaring through ancient skies above temples that predated the Fire Nation's imperial ambitions by millennia uncounted. The man who would become known as the Dragon of the West had earned that fearsome title through military campaigns that carved Fire Nation dominance across vast territories, his strategic brilliance and firebending mastery, making him the most celebrated commander in a nation built upon conquest and expansion. Yet somewhere between the heights of his military glory and the gentle wisdom that would guide his nephew toward redemption, Iroh experienced an encounter so profound that it fundamentally altered his understanding of power, purpose, and the true nature of fire itself. The official histories speak only of Iroh's supposed slaying of the last dragon, a deed that granted him his legendary title, while cementing his reputation as a warrior capable of defeating even the most ancient and powerful creatures in the known world. But those who look deeper into the inconsistencies of this tale discover threads that unravel the entire narrative, revealing gaps and contradictions that suggest the truth was deliberately obscured to protect secrets too dangerous for common knowledge and too sacred for political exploitation by those who would reduce cosmic wisdom to mere tactical advantage. The Sun Warriors who revealed themselves to Aang and Zuko represented the living remnants of the world's first firebending civilization, their culture and knowledge preserved through centuries of deliberate isolation that had protected them from the Fire Nation's increasingly aggressive expansion and philosophical corruption. These guardians of original fire had maintained their sacred traditions in hidden cities that existed beyond the reach of maps and the knowledge of scholars, their very survival dependent upon the world believing them extinct while they continued their ancient practices in temples that had never known the sound of war drums or the smoke of conquest. The dragons, Ran and Shaw, who served as the Sun Warriors' ultimate judges, were beings of such age and wisdom that their memories encompassed the entire history of human firebending, their rainbow flames carrying knowledge that predated written language, and their assessment of worthiness operating according to principles that transcended political loyalty or martial prowess. These ancient creatures understood fire as the element of life rather than destruction, their teaching methods emphasizing harmony with natural forces rather than domination over enemies, their very existence serving as living proof that the Fire Nation's military interpretation of their element represented corruption rather than mastery. The question of how Iroh discovered this supposedly extinct civilization becomes more intriguing when we consider the timeline of his military career and the gradual evolution of his philosophical outlook during the years preceding his son, Lu Ten's tragic death at Ba Sing Se. The general who had once believed in Fire Nation destiny and the righteousness of imperial expansion did not transform overnight into the wise uncle who would serve tea to refugees and speak of the importance of hope and redemption. Such fundamental changes in worldview require catalyzing experiences profound enough to shatter existing beliefs while providing new frameworks for understanding one's place in the cosmic order. The geographical location of Sun Warrior territories suggests that Iroh's encounter might have occurred during one of his early campaigns. Perhaps when he was establishing Fire Nation presence in remote regions where ancient civilizations might still maintain hidden strongholds beyond the awareness of imperial intelligence networks. A young general pursuing glory and territorial expansion could easily have stumbled upon ruins that seemed abandoned, following curiosity or tactical necessity into valleys where time flowed according to different principles and discovery carried consequences that no amount of military training could have prepared him to handle effectively. The isolation that characterizes Sun Warrior culture implies security measures far more sophisticated than simple geographic remoteness, suggesting spiritual protections and concealment techniques that would make accidental discovery nearly impossible unless the intruder possessed qualities that the ancient guardians deemed worthy of their attention. Iroh's natural spiritual sensitivity, evident even during his military years in his appreciation for beauty and his intuitive understanding of balance, might have enabled him to perceive pathways that remained invisible to soldiers whose consciousness was focused entirely upon conquest and material objectives. The rituals that Aang and Zuko underwent to prove their worthiness to the dragons reveal the Sun Warriors' careful evaluation process for determining whether visitors represented genuine seekers of wisdom or potential threats to their carefully preserved traditions. The tests emphasized understanding over strength, spiritual insight over tactical capability, demonstrating that the ancient guardians valued consciousness development far above the martial prowess that Fire Nation culture celebrated as supreme virtue. Such criteria suggest that Iroh's encounter with them occurred only after he had already begun questioning the assumptions that had guided his earlier military career. The rainbow fire that the dragons shared with worthy visitors represented knowledge that went far beyond advanced firebending techniques to encompass fundamental truths about the relationship between consciousness and cosmic forces, wisdom that could transform someone's entire approach to existence while providing spiritual resources adequate for navigating the most challenging moral dilemmas. The experience of witnessing such flames would leave indelible impressions that no amount of subsequent trauma could completely erase, creating foundation for the philosophical development that would eventually enable Iroh to guide others toward enlightenment despite his own history of violence and loss. The question of whether Iroh traveled alone during his encounter with the Sun Warriors becomes crucial when considering how such knowledge could have remained secret despite his high profile within Fire Nation military hierarchy. A general accompanied by soldiers and subordinates would face impossible challenges in concealing discoveries that contradicted official doctrine and imperial propaganda, while someone traveling independently would possess freedom to process profound experiences without external pressure to interpret them, according to established political narratives or career advancement considerations. The transformation that Iroh underwent following his encounter with original fire wisdom would have been gradual rather than immediate, his new understanding requiring time to integrate with existing beliefs, while his continued military responsibilities demanded performance consistent with Fire Nation expectations of decisive leadership. The internal conflict between cosmic wisdom and imperial duty might have created the philosophical tensions that eventually contributed to his withdrawal from active command, as the general, who had learned fire's true nature, found it increasingly difficult to apply that knowledge in service of conquest and domination. The death of Lieutenant Ba Sing Se provided the emotional catalyst that completed Iroh's transformation. His grief over losing his beloved son, finally breaking through whatever psychological barriers had prevented him from fully embracing the wisdom he had gained from his dragon encounter. The father who mourned his child's sacrifice for imperial ambitions could no longer maintain the compartmentalization that had allowed him to serve Fire Nation interests while knowing that their interpretation of firebending represented fundamental misunderstanding of cosmic principles. The years following Lu Ten's death revealed the full extent of Iroh's transformation, as he gradually abandoned his position within Fire Nation hierarchy to pursue deeper understanding of spiritual truths that military culture could neither appreciate nor accommodate. His journey through the Earth Kingdom as a refugee and wanderer provided opportunities to apply Sun Warrior wisdom in contexts completely removed from Fire Nation politics, allowing him to develop the teaching methods and philosophical insights that would eventually enable him to guide Zuko toward redemption. The tea shop in Ba Sing Se, where Iroh found temporary contentment, represented the culmination of his journey from conquest to service. His happiness in simple tasks and genuine relationships, demonstrating how completely he had absorbed the Sun Warriors' emphasis on finding joy in harmony rather than satisfaction in dominance. The customers who appreciated his tea and conversation had no knowledge of his former military glory, accepting him simply as a kind old man whose presence brought comfort and whose wisdom emerged naturally from lived experience rather than imposed authority. The prison cell, where Iroh spent months preparing for his role in liberating the city, provided the perfect environment for deep meditation on everything he had learned from dragons and life experience alike. His physical confinement, creating space for spiritual preparation that would enable him to serve as crucial support for the Avatar's mission while maintaining his commitment to redemption rather than revenge. The firebending techniques he practiced in solitude drew directly upon Sun Warrior principles, his flames carrying the life-giving warmth that dragons had taught him, rather than the destructive heat that Fire Nation military doctrine emphasized. The reunion with Zuko that provided the emotional climax for both uncle and nephew's character development was made possible by Iroh's long journey from Dragon of the West to spiritual guide, his patience and wisdom creating the foundation that enabled his nephew to choose redemption over revenge, despite years of trauma and misdirection. The tea that they shared represented not just family reconciliation, but validation of the path that had led from dragon flames to human healing, demonstrating how ancient wisdom could serve contemporary needs when applied with love, rather than implemented through force. The dragons who had preserved original fire knowledge through millennia of human corruption and conflict had recognized in young General Iroh someone capable of carrying their wisdom into the world while adapting it to circumstances they could not directly influence. Their choice to reveal themselves to him represented investment in humanity's potential for spiritual development. Despite overwhelming evidence of destructive tendencies, faith that consciousness could evolve beyond its current limitations when provided with proper guidance and sufficient motivation to embrace transformation over stagnation. The legacy of Iroh's dragon encounter extends far beyond his individual transformation to encompass his influence on Zuko's development, and through him the post-war reformation of Fire Nation culture itself. The prince who learned about honor and redemption from his uncle carried forward wisdom that originally flowed from rainbow flames, demonstrating how ancient knowledge could propagate through human relationships when transmitted with genuine care, rather than imposed through institutional authority or political manipulation. The mystery of exactly when and how Iroh discovered the Sun Warriors may never be fully resolved, but its implications continue to resonate through every interaction where wisdom triumphs over ignorance and compassion overcomes the impulse for revenge. The transformation of the Dragon of the West, from destroyer to healer, stands as testament to consciousness's capacity for fundamental change, when exposed to truth profound enough to shatter limiting beliefs while providing vision, inspiring enough to sustain the difficult work of becoming someone worthy of ancient wisdom and eternal flames that burn with life rather than death, creation rather than destruction, love rather than fear. The bloodlines that flow through the veins of the Avatar world carry secrets more complex than any genealogical chart could capture, their hidden connections, weaving patterns of inheritance that extend far beyond simple family trees to encompass political alliances, cultural preservation, and the mysterious ways that love transcends the boundaries that war and prejudice attempt to establish. In the shadows cast by grand historical narratives of nations and elements, quieter stories unfold about hearts that found each other across enemy lines and children who inherited not just their parents' features, but the responsibility of bridging worlds that their ancestors had spent generations trying to keep apart. The mystery surrounding Lin and Suyin's parentage represents one of the most intriguing genealogical puzzles in the post-war world, their different fathers remaining unnamed, despite the significant implications their identities might carry. For understanding how the Earth Kingdom's most prominent metal-bending family developed during the crucial years of reconstruction and social transformation. Toph's reluctance to discuss these relationships publicly suggests complications that extend beyond simple privacy preferences to encompass political sensitivities and personal vulnerabilities that even the most direct and honest Earthbender found difficult to navigate with her characteristic bluntness and disregard for social conventions. The timeline of Toph's relationships coincides with some of the most turbulent periods in Republic City's development, when the former Cranefish town was transforming from colonial settlement into multicultural metropolis, while managing tensions between traditional authority structures and innovative forms of governance that required cooperation across cultural boundaries. The men who captured her attention during this period would have been navigating their own challenges related to identity, opportunity, and the kind of future they wanted to build in a world where old certainties had been shattered by war's end, and new possibilities remained largely untested by practical experience. Satoru's emergence as a potential father figure gains credibility when examined alongside the broader context of Fire Nation individuals who chose to remain in former colonial territories rather than returning to their ancestral homeland after the war's conclusion. As the son of Laban, the industrialist who had partnered with Lao Beifong to establish the Earth and Fire refinery, Satoru represented exactly the kind of cross-cultural collaboration that characterized the most successful reconstruction efforts while embodying the personal relationships that made such cooperation emotionally meaningful rather than merely economically advantageous. The attraction between Toph and Satoru that manifested during the crisis involving General Old Iron carried undertones that extended far beyond teenage romance to encompass the symbolic significance of Earth Kingdom and Fire Nation, individuals choosing partnership over the inherited hostility that previous generations had accepted as natural and inevitable. Their connection developed while they were literally fighting to protect a festival celebrating harmony between human and spirit worlds, creating circumstances where personal affection and cosmic principles aligned in ways that made their relationship feel spiritually significant, rather than merely convenient or politically expedient. The industrial context that brought their families together provides additional layers of meaning to their potential romantic involvement, suggesting that the next generation might heal divisions created by war through business partnerships that evolved into personal relationships based on mutual respect and shared vision rather than strategic calculation. The refinery that had initially created tension between traditional Earth Kingdom values and Fire Nation innovation could become a symbol of successful integration if the children of its founders chose to build lives together that honored both heritages while creating something entirely new. But Satoru's identity as one potential father raises questions about the timing and circumstances that would have enabled a relationship between him and Toph to develop beyond the initial attraction witnessed during the Spirit Crisis. The geographical distance between Republic City and the locations where he would likely have continued his family's industrial interests might have created obstacles to sustained courtship, while their different cultural backgrounds would have required significant accommodation and understanding from both parties to overcome differences in values, expectations, and approaches to life that went far deeper than simple personality preferences. The mystery of Lin's father becomes particularly intriguing when considered alongside her personality traits and professional choices, which might provide clues about paternal influence that shaped her development in ways that Toph's parenting alone could not have accomplished. Lin's rigid adherence to rules and procedures contrasts sharply with her mother's rebellious nature, suggesting exposure to someone who valued order, structure, and institutional authority enough to transmit those preferences. Despite Toph's obvious disdain for conventional approaches to problem-solving and social organization, the possibility that Lin's father might have been someone involved in Republic City's early law enforcement or government establishment could explain her natural gravitation toward police work and her instinctive understanding of how bureaucratic systems operate even when they frustrate her with their inefficiency and political complications. Such paternal influence might also account for her sophisticated grasp of urban politics and her ability to navigate complex relationships with elected officials and business leaders who required handling quite different from the direct confrontation that Toph typically preferred. Suyin's contrasting personality and life choices suggest different paternal influence. Someone whose values emphasized creativity, flexibility, and the importance of family relationships over professional achievement or social recognition. Her success as an innovator and community leader in Zaofu demonstrates leadership qualities that differ markedly from both her mother's and sister's approaches to authority, suggesting exposure to someone who understood how to inspire loyalty through vision and personal charisma rather than through intimidation or institutional position. The cultural sophistication evident in Zaofu's architecture and social organization implies that Suyin's father might have possessed artistic sensibilities and philosophical depth that complemented Toph's practical, earth-bending mastery while providing their daughter with appreciation for beauty, harmony, and the kinds of cultural refinement that create environments where people choose to live rather than simply surviving circumstances they cannot escape. Such influence would explain Suyin's ability to create a community that attracts talented individuals from across the world while maintaining the personal warmth that makes them want to stay and contribute to collective flourishing. The timing of both relationships within Toph's life suggests that she might have been exploring different aspects of her own identity through partnerships with men who represented contrasting approaches to the challenges and opportunities that the post-war world presented to ambitious individuals seeking to build meaningful lives. The earthbender, who had spent her childhood confined by overprotective parents and her adolescence fighting for survival, might have needed relationships that helped her understand different ways of being strong, different definitions of success, and different approaches to balancing personal happiness with social responsibility. The secrecy surrounding these relationships reflects broader social tensions about cross-cultural romance during periods when national identities remained politically sensitive despite official policies promoting cooperation and integration. Individual families navigating such relationships would have faced scrutiny and judgment from communities still processing the trauma of recent conflict, while trying to determine which traditional boundaries deserved preservation and which represented obstacles to the kind of healing that lasting peace would require from all parties involved in reconstruction efforts. The economic dimensions of these potential relationships cannot be ignored, as both Lin and Suyin's fathers would likely have been individuals with sufficient resources and social standing to attract someone of Toph's prominence and independence. The Beifong family's wealth and influence would have made Toph a desirable partner for men seeking to establish themselves in Republic City's emerging power structure, while also creating situations where genuine affection might be difficult to distinguish from strategic calculation aimed at advancing career prospects or business interests. The children who resulted from these relationships inherited not just their parents' individual characteristics, but the responsibility of embodying successful integration between different cultural traditions and approaches to life, that their very existence helped to validate and normalize. Lin and Suyin's contrasting paths through life demonstrate different strategies for managing mixed heritage while contributing to society in ways that honor both sides of their background, without requiring them to choose exclusive loyalty to any single cultural identity or national allegiance. The professional choices that both women made in their adult lives reflect different aspects of their inherited complexity, with Lin's police work serving the order and security that multicultural societies require to function effectively, while Suyin's community leadership demonstrates the innovation and cooperation necessary for creating new forms of social organization that transcend traditional limitations. Their different approaches to family relationships also suggest different models for how mixed heritage individuals might balance personal fulfillment with social contribution, while managing the expectations and opportunities that their prominent family background created. The mystery of their fathers' identities extends beyond simple biographical curiosity to encompass questions about how the post-war generation processed the emotional legacy of conflict while building institutions and relationships capable of sustaining peace across cultural boundaries that had previously been maintained through mutual suspicion and periodic violence. The men who chose relationships with Toph were making statements about their vision for the future as much as following personal romantic inclinations, their choices carrying implications for how quickly and completely the Avatar world could move beyond war's divisions. The secrecy that continues to surround these relationships decades after they occurred suggests ongoing sensitivities about cross-cultural romance and the political implications of mixed heritage families in positions of prominence and authority. The discretion that Toph maintains about her past might reflect not shame about her choices, but understanding that revealing certain information could complicate her daughters' professional lives or create security vulnerabilities that enemies might attempt to exploit through threats against family members whose identities had been protected through careful silence. The broader pattern of hidden relationships and unacknowledged parentage throughout the Avatar world reflects the complex ways that individuals navigate between personal desires and social expectations during periods of rapid change when traditional rules no longer provide clear guidance, but new norms have not yet become established enough to offer reliable alternatives. The families that form across cultural boundaries serve as testing grounds for the kinds of integration that political leaders promote in public, while private citizens work out the practical and emotional challenges of making such ideals function in daily life. As we contemplate the mysteries surrounding these hidden bloodlines and forgotten connections, we begin to understand that the most important inheritance passed between generations might not be genetic traits or cultural traditions, but rather the courage to love across boundaries that others consider impossible to bridge, the wisdom to create families that serve peace rather than perpetuating conflict, and the strength to raise children capable of building futures that honor the past without being imprisoned by its limitations or fears. The secrets that remain unspoken might be less important than the love that speaks through generations, creating connections that transcend the categories that war had tried to make permanent and absolute. The mysteries that surround the fundamental mechanics of elemental manipulation reveal contradictions so profound that they challenge our most basic assumptions about the relationship between consciousness, spiritual energy, and the physical laws that govern natural phenomena throughout the Avatar world. These paradoxes emerge not from casual observation, but from careful analysis of techniques that seem to violate established principles while producing effects that are undeniably real, forcing us to confront the possibility that bending operates according to rules that transcend conventional understanding of matter, energy, and the limitations that normally constrain how living beings interact with their environment. The phenomenon of waterbending techniques cutting through solid metal with fluid grace represents perhaps the most glaring violation of basic physics principles, yet the effectiveness of such applications has been demonstrated repeatedly by masters, whose precision and power leave no doubt about the reality of their achievements. When Katara's water whips slice through Fire Nation armor with surgical precision, or when Paku's ice projectiles penetrate steel barriers as if they were paper, we witness manipulation of liquid that operates according to principles that extend far beyond conventional understanding of pressure, velocity, and material properties. The physics of high-pressure water cutting requires extremely focused streams, traveling at tremendous velocity through specialized equipment that concentrates force into areas so small that material bonds cannot maintain their structural integrity under such concentrated stress. Industrial water jet cutting systems achieve their effects through precise control of pressure and flow that creates forces measured in thousands of pounds per square inch. Yet waterbenders accomplish similar results through techniques that appear to involve gentle, curved motions that should dissipate rather than concentrate the energy required for such devastating effectiveness. The curved trajectories that characterize waterbending combat techniques present particular challenges to conventional physics explanations, as the flowing, dancing movements that masters employ seem designed to create beautiful spectacle rather than maximize kinetic impact against resistant materials. The serpentine paths that water follows under bender control should reduce velocity and disperse force according to normal fluid dynamics. Yet these graceful attacks consistently prove more effective than the straight-line applications that engineering principles would suggest as optimal for cutting applications. The temperature variations that waterbenders achieve through conscious control reveal another layer of mystery in how elemental manipulation transcends normal thermodynamic limitations while producing effects that demonstrate mastery over molecular motion and phase transitions that should require vast amounts of thermal energy to accomplish rapidly. The instantaneous transformation of liquid water into sharp ice projectiles, or the equally rapid melting of solid ice into flowing streams, suggests control over thermal dynamics that operates through mechanisms entirely different from conventional heating and cooling processes. The scale of thermal manipulation that master waterbenders demonstrate becomes even more remarkable when considered alongside the energy requirements that such rapid phase transitions would normally demand from external heat sources or cooling systems. The amount of energy required to freeze substantial quantities of water into solid ice within seconds should create temperature effects throughout the surrounding environment. Yet waterbenders accomplish these feats without apparent impact on ambient conditions or their own physical comfort during extended combat encounters. The mystery deepens when we examine Sozin's comet and its enhancement of firebending abilities despite the celestial body's composition of ice, rock, and cosmic debris that contains no inherent fire or thermal energy capable of augmenting elemental manipulation techniques. The comet's appearance in Earth's vicinity creates spectacular displays of atmospheric friction that generate visible flames, but these effects result from the interaction between the comet's material and planetary atmosphere rather than emanating from any fire-producing properties of the comet itself. The astronomical mechanics that govern comet behavior involve gravitational forces and orbital dynamics that bear no apparent relationship to the spiritual or elemental energies that enable bending abilities. Yet the correlation between Sozin's comet's approach and the dramatic enhancement of firebending power has been documented across multiple historical periods, with sufficient consistency to establish clear causal relationships that defy conventional understanding of how celestial bodies might influence human capabilities. The enhancement effect extends far beyond simple increases in flame temperature or duration to encompass fundamental improvements in firebending precision, range, and the ability to maintain techniques for extended periods without the fatigue that normally limits prolonged elemental manipulation. The comet's influence appears to operate at levels that affect the basic spiritual connection between benders and their element, rather than simply providing additional energy that practitioners can channel through existing techniques and established training methods. The contradiction becomes more puzzling when considered alongside the moon's well-documented influence on waterbending abilities, which operates according to principles that seem more intuitively connected to tidal forces and gravitational effects that demonstrably influence liquid behavior throughout natural systems. The lunar enhancement of waterbending suggests cosmic influences that work through mechanisms related to the gravitational forces that affect all water on the planet, creating logical connections between celestial positioning and enhanced elemental control that parallel observable natural phenomena. The full moon's empowerment of advanced waterbending techniques like bloodbending reveals how celestial influences can enable manipulation of bodily fluids that should be protected from external control through natural barriers and biological safeguards that exist specifically to prevent such intrusion. The violation of bodily autonomy that bloodbending represents challenges not only physical understanding of how elemental manipulation should function, but moral and spiritual principles about the sanctity of individual consciousness and Bayfirs, the boundaries that should exist between self and external control. The biological mechanisms that enable bloodbending suggest manipulation of circulatory systems through waterbending techniques that somehow penetrate skin, muscle, and other protective tissues to directly influence fluids that remain inside living bodies throughout normal circumstances. The precision required for such control implies spiritual connection to elemental forces that transcends normal sensory limitations, while enabling benders to perceive and manipulate water that exists beyond their direct observation or physical contact. The spiritual requirements for developing bloodbending abilities appear to involve fundamental alterations in how waterbenders relate to their element, suggesting that advanced techniques require practitioners to abandon or transcend normal ethical constraints about consent and personal boundaries that prevent most benders from exploring applications that violate other beings' autonomy. The psychological transformation necessary for such development implies that elemental mastery and moral development might sometimes proceed along divergent paths that create capabilities alongside character changes. The animals throughout the Avatar world who demonstrate natural bending abilities present additional mysteries about how elemental manipulation developed and spread among species that lack the conscious spiritual training that humans require to achieve similar capabilities. Flying bison navigate through airbending that appears completely instinctive, their massive forms defying gravitational forces through techniques that require no apparent learning period or spiritual preparation, despite their complexity and power requirements. The dragons whose firebending preceded human development of similar techniques demonstrate mastery that extends far beyond simple flame production to encompass the rainbow fires that carry spiritual significance and educational value, impossible to achieve through conventional thermal manipulation. Their teaching methods suggest understanding of fire's deeper nature that operates through principles unavailable to practitioners who approach their element through purely technical or martial applications rather than spiritual communion with fundamental forces. The badger moles, whose earthbending abilities enabled them to carve extensive tunnel systems through solid rock, demonstrate integration of elemental manipulation with natural behavior that suggests bending developed as evolutionary adaptation rather than learned skill acquired through conscious training and spiritual development. Their seismic sense capabilities provide them with environmental awareness that exceeds normal sensory limitations while enabling navigation and communication through earth-transmitted vibrations that carry information across vast distances. The spiritual connections that link certain animal species to specific elements imply evolutionary relationships between consciousness and elemental forces that developed through processes extending far beyond the historical period when humans first learned bending from animal teachers. The original bending masters possessed capabilities that suggested lifetimes of development and refinement, yet they appeared to be teaching knowledge that was fundamental to their nature, rather than sharing techniques that they had consciously developed through experimentation and practice. The hybrid creatures that populate the Avatar world raise additional questions about how spiritual and elemental energies influence biological development and reproduction in ways that create species combinations impossible according to normal genetic principles. The turtle ducks, platypus bears, and other mixed animals demonstrate characteristics that suggest spiritual forces capable of transcending conventional reproductive barriers while creating stable hybrid populations that maintain their distinctive traits across multiple generations. The distribution of bending abilities among different populations reveals patterns that defy simple genetic inheritance models, while suggesting spiritual or environmental factors that influence which individuals develop elemental manipulation capabilities within communities where such abilities are present. The universal bending among air nomads contrasts sharply with the partial distribution found in other nations, implying that spiritual practices and cultural values might influence the manifestation of elemental abilities more directly than hereditary factors. The relationship between spiritual enlightenment and bending mastery appears to operate through mechanisms that connect consciousness development with elemental control in ways that transcend simple skill acquisition or physical training regimens. The most advanced practitioners demonstrate capabilities that require spiritual preparation and philosophical understanding that extends far beyond technical proficiency, suggesting that true mastery demands integration of elemental manipulation with broader wisdom about harmony, balance, and the interconnectedness of all existence. The environmental factors that enhance or limit bending abilities reveal additional layers of mystery in how elemental manipulation connects practitioners to cosmic forces and natural cycles that operate on scales far larger than individual consciousness or local circumstances. The eclipse effects that neutralize firebending suggest dependencies on celestial relationships that extend bending influence far beyond the immediate interaction between bender and element to encompass the practitioner's connection to universal forces and planetary energies. As we contemplate these paradoxes and contradictions that surround the fundamental nature of elemental manipulation, we begin to understand that bending might represent something far more profound than simple control over physical forces, something that connects consciousness to the deepest mysteries of existence itself, while demonstrating humanity's potential for transcending normal limitations through spiritual development and harmony with cosmic principles that govern all manifestation throughout the eternal dance between mind and matter, spirit and form, individual will and universal wisdom. The ancient creatures that once walked alongside humans as teachers and companions have vanished into realms that exist beyond the reach of maps and the knowledge of scholars, their absence leaving gaps in the world's spiritual fabric that no amount of technological progress or political achievement can adequately fill. Among these lost wonders, none carries more mystery than the final lion turtle who granted Aang the power of energy bending before disappearing into horizons that stretched beyond the boundaries between physical and spirit worlds, his massive form carrying with it secrets about the nature of consciousness and the origins of bending that might never again be accessible to human understanding. The lion turtle's departure after teaching Aang the most profound spiritual technique in recorded history was accomplished without fanfare or explanation. His ancient wisdom, apparently concluding that his work with the current avatar had reached natural completion, while leaving countless questions unanswered about his destination, his intentions, and the fate that awaited the last survivor of a species that had once served as humanity's protectors and guides during civilization's earliest struggles against forces that threatened survival and spiritual development. The direction of the lion turtle's movement suggested journey toward oceanic regions that remained unexplored even by the most adventurous travelers and ambitious cartographers. Areas where currents and weather patterns created conditions so challenging that conventional vessels could not safely navigate, while the spiritual energies that surrounded such remote locations made them unsuitable for settlement by populations that lacked the cosmic perspective necessary to coexist with forces that operated according to principles transcending normal human understanding and earthly concerns. The possibility that the lion turtle sought refuge in regions where the boundaries between physical and spirit worlds remained fluid enough to accommodate beings whose existence spanned both realms offers hope that his apparent disappearance might represent transition rather than termination, transformation into forms of existence that no longer required interaction with material reality while maintaining influence over spiritual development through mechanisms too subtle for casual observation, but profound enough to guide consciousness evolution across species and generations. The ancient memories that the lion turtle carried within his vast consciousness encompassed the entire history of human development, from the earliest refugees who had sought protection on his shell cities during humanity's prehistoric struggles against spirits who had not yet learned to coexist peacefully with mortal populations. His knowledge included the original purposes of bending, the spiritual principles that had guided the first human benders, and the wisdom that had enabled different species to develop cooperative relationships that served mutual survival and advancement rather than competitive domination. The energy bending technique that he taught Aang represented knowledge so dangerous and powerful that it had been deliberately removed from general circulation, its applications requiring spiritual purity and moral certainty that few practitioners throughout history had been capable of maintaining under the pressures and temptations that accompanied such intimate power over other beings. Consciousness. The lion turtle's decision to share this technique suggested both desperate necessity created by the approaching comet crisis and confidence that Aang possessed the character needed to wield such power without becoming corrupted by impossibility. The isolation that had protected the lion turtle throughout the century of war also meant that his knowledge of human development remained limited to what he could observe from oceanic distances. His understanding of contemporary civilization filtered through encounters with individuals who possessed sufficient spiritual sensitivity to perceive his presence while lacking comprehensive awareness of how societies had evolved during his absence from active involvement in mortal affairs and political development throughout the four nations. The artifacts that disappeared alongside their creators represent losses that extend far beyond simple material objects to encompass tools and weapons that had been crafted according to principles combining elemental mastery with metallurgical knowledge that surpassed anything achievable through conventional techniques available to contemporary smiths and artisans. Among these vanished treasures, Sokka's meteorite sword stands as perhaps the most accessible example of how irreplaceable items can be lost through circumstances that make recovery seem impossible despite their obvious value and significance. The space sword that Sokka had crafted with such dedication and pride during his training with Master Piandao represented more than simple weapon acquisition or martial accomplishment, embodying his determination to contribute meaningfully to Team Avatar's mission, despite lacking the bending abilities that provided his companions with supernatural combat capabilities. The meteorite material that formed the blade carried properties that made it harder and more durable than conventional steel, while maintaining edge retention and balance characteristics that elevated it far above ordinary weapons in both effectiveness and symbolic significance. The loss of this unique blade during the airship battle over Wulong Forest occurred under circumstances that made immediate recovery impossible, while subsequent political developments and reconstruction priorities relegated artifact retrieval to secondary importance compared to the overwhelming challenges of establishing peace and rebuilding damaged civilizations. The swords fall into forested terrain that had been devastated by the battle's environmental damage, created search conditions that would challenge even experienced recovery teams. equipped with specialized detection equipment. The meteorite composition that made the sword so valuable also created properties that would enable detection through metal bending techniques if sufficient time and resources were devoted to systematic search efforts covering the impact area where the weapon had fallen during the chaotic final moments of Sozin's comet's passage. Toph's seismic sense capabilities, combined with her unprecedented metal-bending mastery, would provide search advantages impossible through conventional methods, while creating opportunities for recovery missions that could serve both practical and symbolic purposes. The sentimental value that the sword carried for Sokka extended beyond its material properties or combat applications to encompass memories of training, achievement, and personal growth that had transformed him from frustrated non-bender into confident warrior, capable of contributing to cosmic struggles through intelligence, creativity, and courage that transcended any limitations created by lack of elemental abilities. The weapon's recovery would provide emotional closure, while validating the importance of non-bender contributions to Avatar missions and spiritual development. The boomerang that Sokka sacrificed during the same battle to save Fire Nation soldiers from falling to their deaths represented his characteristic willingness to prioritize others' welfare over personal attachment to objects that carried deep emotional significance. His instant decision to help enemies demonstrating moral development that elevated him far above the tribal warrior he had been at the series' beginning, while illustrating how war's end required forgiveness and mutual assistance, rather than continued hostility and revenge. The tragedy of Bosco's fate represents loss of innocence that extends far beyond one animal's death, to encompass the destruction of wonder and gentleness that war inevitably creates when survival becomes more important than preserving the beauty and joy that make existence meaningful, rather than merely functional. The dancing bear who had brought such delight to Earth King Quay embodied the kind of pure happiness that thrives only in environments where safety and abundance create space for play, creativity, and the cultivation of relationships based on affection rather than utility or strategic advantage. The horror of Bosco becoming a meal for Earth Queen Houting reveals how quickly societies can abandon values that once seemed fundamental when political power becomes concentrated in individuals whose character cannot withstand the corrupting influences that accompany absolute authority over others' lives and deaths. The Queen's willingness to consume a creature that had been beloved throughout the Earth Kingdom demonstrated moral degradation that extended far beyond personal cruelty to encompass systematic destruction of cultural symbols and emotional connections that bound communities together. The confirmation that Bosco's fate was indeed as grisly as implied reflects the creator's understanding that meaningful storytelling sometimes requires confronting uncomfortable truths about how evil manifests through seemingly civilized institutions and respected positions when conscience becomes subordinated to appetite, and power eliminates external constraints on behavior that normal social relationships would never tolerate. The bear's death serves as a reminder that tyranny's victims include not just political opponents, but innocent creatures, whose only crime was existing in proximity to those who view all life as expendable resources. The ancient temples that dot the landscape throughout the Avatar world contain chambers and passages that remain unexplored despite centuries of occupation and study, their deepest reaches protected by spiritual guardians and architectural challenges that prevent casual exploration, while reserving access for individuals whose development has reached levels adequate for safely encountering knowledge and artifacts that lesser preparation could not handle without dangerous consequences for both explorer and broader community that might suffer from premature exposure to forces requiring wisdom and restraint. The air temples that survived the Fire Nation's genocide attempts retain libraries and storage areas that might contain scrolls, artifacts, and preserved specimens that could provide invaluable information about air nomad culture, spiritual practices, and the natural history of species that became extinct during the Century of War, when survival took precedence over preservation and documentation efforts became impossible under conditions of constant threat and displacement from traditional territories and protective environments. The hidden valleys where flying bison might have survived the systematic extermination efforts present possibilities for discovery that could transform understanding of both species' survival strategies and the extent to which the genocide succeeded in eliminating air nomad culture from the world. The remote locations that would have been necessary for such survival would also have preserved other elements of pre-war civilization, including plant species, architectural techniques, and spiritual practices that might otherwise have been lost forever when the temples fell to Fire Nation attacks. The spirit animals that maintain connections between physical and spiritual realms represent evolutionary development that transcends normal biological categories, while demonstrating how consciousness can manifest through forms that bridge different levels of reality. These creatures possess capabilities that suggest direct spiritual inheritance rather than learned behaviors, their abilities appearing to be fundamental aspects of their nature rather than skills acquired through training or environmental adaptation over multiple generations of development and refinement. The relationship between spirit animals and their physical counterparts reveals patterns of development that might explain how certain species developed bending abilities, while others remained limited to conventional biological capabilities. The spiritual dimensions that enable some creatures to manipulate elemental forces might result from evolutionary pressures that favored individuals capable of transcending normal physical limitations through consciousness development that paralleled but preceded human spiritual advancement and elemental mastery. The White Lotus organization's role in preserving ancient knowledge during the Century of War suggests that other secret societies might have maintained hidden repositories of artifacts, texts, and specimens that survived destruction through careful concealment and protective measures that prevented their discovery by those who would have used such resources for destructive rather than preservative purposes. The network of scholars and wise individuals who formed such organizations would have possessed both the knowledge and resources necessary for long-term preservation efforts. The extinct species that might yet survive in remote locations present possibilities for rediscovery that could restore balance to ecosystems that have been operating with incomplete populations and missing relationships for longer than most current inhabitants can remember. The return of such species would provide more than biological diversity enhancement, offering opportunities for re-establishing spiritual connections and natural partnerships that had been severed by war's violence and environmental destruction. As we drift deeper into contemplation of these vanished wonders and lost treasures, perhaps we find comfort in the possibility that disappearance does not always mean destruction. That absence from our immediate awareness does not preclude existence in realms beyond our current capacity to perceive or access. The lion turtle's journey continues somewhere beyond our maps. Sokka's sword waits in forest depths for hands skilled enough to find it, and the spirits of vanished creatures maintain their eternal vigil over truths too precious to be lost forever, too important to remain hidden when consciousness develops sufficient wisdom to receive them with proper reverence and protective care. The smaller societies that exist in the spaces between great nations have developed cultures and traditions that often predate the political boundaries that modern maps accept as natural and permanent. Their isolation, creating laboratories for human adaptation and spiritual development that operate according to principles quite different from those governing larger civilizations, with their emphasis on territorial expansion, military dominance, and the accumulation of resources that enable projection of power across vast distances and diverse populations that may share little beyond geographical proximity and nominal political allegiance. The Foggy Swamp Tribe represents perhaps the most intriguing example of how environmental conditions can shape cultural development in directions that transcend normal expectations about elemental specialization and social development. Organization, their waterbending techniques, adapted to humid jungle conditions that require manipulation of moisture suspended in air rather than flowing in rivers or contained in artificial reservoirs. Their understanding of water as omnipresent atmospheric component rather than discrete liquid substance has enabled innovations that challenge conventional waterbending theory while demonstrating practical applications that masters from other traditions might never discover despite superior technical training and broader theoretical knowledge. The spiritual insights that emerge from foggy swamp isolation reflect direct contact with plant consciousness and ecosystem dynamics that urbanized populations never experience, their daily lives integrated with natural cycles that operate according to temporal scales, extending far beyond individual human lifespans or even generational memory. The vine-swinging navigation techniques that substitute for conventional transportation methods create intimate familiarity with three-dimensional jungle geography while developing physical capabilities and spatial awareness that ground-bound travelers could never acquire through normal movement patterns and environmental interactions. The philosophical implications of swamp tribe waterbending suggest elemental mastery that emphasizes adaptation and flow rather than control and dominance, their techniques working with humidity and precipitation patterns, rather than attempting to impose external will upon resistant natural forces. This approach to bending creates practitioners whose abilities remain closely connected to environmental conditions, while limiting their effectiveness in artificial contexts, where water must be imported or stored rather than accessed. Through atmospheric manipulation and natural accumulation processes, the political isolation that has preserved swamp tribe independence throughout periods when larger nations expanded their territorial claims and administrative control reflects both geographical protection provided by challenging terrain and deliberate choices about maintaining cultural autonomy, rather than accepting integration into larger political entities that would require abandoning traditional practices in favor of standardized approaches to governance, resource management, and social organization that serve administrative efficiency rather than community well-being or spiritual development. The desert tribes of the Siwong region have developed survival strategies and social structures that demonstrate human adaptability to environments so harsh that most populations would consider them uninhabitable. Their nomadic lifestyle, creating mobility advantages that enable them to avoid political control by settled governments, while accessing resources scattered across vast territories through knowledge accumulated over countless generations of desert navigation and resource location expertise that cannot be acquired through formal education or imported from other climatic regions. The sand-bending techniques that desert tribes have refined through necessity provide capabilities that Earth Kingdom military forces and civilian populations rarely encounter. Their manipulation of granular materials, creating advantages in desert terrain, while presenting challenges for opponents trained in conventional earthbending applications that assume access to solid stone and compacted soil, rather than shifting surfaces that respond differently to traditional techniques and established combat strategies developed for more predictable environmental conditions. The commercial relationships that desert tribes maintain with settled populations through trading expeditions and market participation demonstrate economic integration that preserves cultural independence while providing access to manufactured goods and exotic resources that desert environments cannot produce locally. Their knowledge of trade routes and seasonal variations in market conditions makes them valuable intermediaries between distant regions, while their mobility enables them to exploit price differentials and resource scarcities that stationary merchants cannot address effectively or rapidly enough to maximize profit opportunities. The spiritual practices that desert tribes have developed through constant exposure to environmental extremes emphasize endurance, patience, and harmony with natural forces that can destroy those who attempt to resist or control them through conventional approaches to survival and resource management. Their relationship with the desert reflects understanding that emerges only through generations of accommodation to conditions that require surrender of illusions about human dominance over natural forces, while developing capabilities that enable thriving under circumstances that would devastate populations accustomed to more forgiving environments. The Sun Warriors, whose survival was revealed through Aang and Zuko's encounter, represent the most dramatic example of how isolated communities can preserve ancient wisdom and traditional practices through deliberate concealment from larger civilizations whose development has proceeded in directions that threaten the survival of knowledge and techniques that once served as foundations for more balanced approaches to elemental mastery and spiritual development than contemporary applications that emphasize military effectiveness over harmony with cosmic principles. The architectural achievements that Sun Warrior civilization has maintained through centuries of isolation demonstrate engineering capabilities that integrate structural functionality with spiritual symbolism while creating environments that serve both practical needs and consciousness development. Through design elements that facilitate meditation, community gathering, and the kind of educational experiences that connect individual development with larger patterns of cosmic significance and eternal principles that transcend temporal political concerns and material acquisition priorities. The Dragon Partnership that defines Sun Warrior culture represents interspecies cooperation that predates and transcends the human-spirit relationships that characterize other forms of advanced spiritual development. Their integration with Ran and Shaw, creating community structures that operate according to principles unavailable to societies that lack access to such profound sources of wisdom and guidance from beings whose perspective encompasses geological timescales and cosmic cycles that dwarf human historical awareness and individual memory. The testing procedures that Sun Warriors employ to evaluate potential students reveal selection criteria that prioritize spiritual worthiness over technical capability or social status. Their willingness to share ancient fire knowledge, depending upon character assessment that operates through principles too subtle for conventional evaluation methods, while ensuring that dangerous techniques remain accessible only to individuals whose development provides adequate safeguards against corruption by power or misuse of abilities that could cause widespread destruction if employed without proper wisdom and moral restraint. The avatar identification processes that would operate within smaller tribal communities present logistical and cultural challenges quite different from those faced by the major nations, with their established institutions, trained personnel, and systematic approaches to recognizing and supporting avatar development through resources and expertise that isolated populations simply cannot provide despite their potential wisdom and spiritual insights that might prove valuable for avatar education and consciousness development. Under appropriate circumstances and with adequate preparation, the possibility that an avatar might be born into desert nomad communities raises questions about how traditional toys and artifacts used for avatar identification would function in cultures whose material possessions remain limited by mobility requirements and resource scarcity, while their spiritual practices might provide alternative recognition methods that operate through direct consciousness assessment rather than symbolic object selection or formal testing procedures that require institutional infrastructure and specialized knowledge about avatar history and development patterns. The educational challenges that isolated tribes would face in preparing a newly identified avatar for cosmic responsibilities would require innovative approaches to elemental training and spiritual development that adapt traditional methods to available resources while somehow providing access to knowledge and techniques that might exist only within communities whose isolation or hostility would make cooperation difficult or impossible. Under normal diplomatic circumstances and established protocols for intertribal relationship and knowledge-sharing agreements, the cultural preservation that small tribes accomplish through their continued existence provides alternatives to mainstream approaches to social organization, resource management, and spiritual development that serve as living laboratories for human potential, while demonstrating that survival and success can be achieved through methods quite different from those employed by larger civilizations, with their emphasis on expansion, accumulation, and the projection of influence that often comes at considerable cost to environmental sustainability and individual well-being. The political implications of avatar birth within isolated communities would create unprecedented challenges for both the individual avatar and the larger world that depends upon avatar intervention during periods of crisis and imbalance. The limited resources and political neutrality that characterize smaller tribes, potentially creating advantages in some circumstances, while presenting serious disadvantages when dealing with threats that require coordination of major military forces and economic resources that only larger nations can provide effectively and rapidly enough to address emergency conditions. The intertribal relationships that develop through trade, marriage, and seasonal cooperation create networks of mutual support and information sharing that operate below the level of major political attention, while providing resilience and adaptability that larger institutions often lack due to their size and bureaucratic complexity. These informal relationships might prove crucial for supporting avatar development within smaller communities while providing access to resources and expertise that tribal isolation would otherwise make unavailable through conventional, diplomatic and educational channels. The seasonal migrations that characterize many smaller tribes create mobility patterns that enable them to avoid political control while accessing diverse environments and resources that would be unavailable to settled populations. Their movement cycles, creating opportunities for cultural exchange and knowledge acquisition that complement their specialized adaptations to particular environmental conditions and resource exploitation strategies that serve both survival, needs, and spiritual development through intimate connection with natural forces and seasonal cycles. The resistance to assimilation that smaller tribes demonstrate through their continued independence reflects conscious choices about preserving cultural identity and traditional practices, rather than simply accepting integration into larger political and economic systems that might provide material advantages while requiring abandonment of values and approaches to life that have served their communities effectively across many generations of environmental challenge and social change, that tested but did not destroy their commitment to autonomous development and spiritual growth. As we contemplate the quiet strength and hidden wisdom of these smaller societies existing between the great nations, we find ourselves drawn to consider how diversity of human organization and spiritual approach creates resilience for our entire species, how the alternatives that isolated communities preserve might prove essential when larger civilizations face challenges that their established methods cannot address, and how the Avatar's role as bridge between worlds extends beyond connecting human and spirit realms to encompass the equally important task of facilitating understanding and cooperation between different approaches to the eternal human quest for meaning, security, and harmony with forces larger than individual consciousness can fully comprehend or control. The spiritual paradox that surrounds the air nomad's universal bending ability represents one of the most profound mysteries in understanding how elemental gifts manifest across different populations and cultural contexts. Their perfect consistency in producing airbending children challenging every established theory about genetic inheritance, environmental influence, and the role that individual spiritual development plays in determining whether consciousness can achieve the harmony with elemental forces that enables bending mastery and the practical application of such abilities in daily life and spiritual practice. The impossibility of non-bender air nomads emerges not from casual observation but from careful examination of their entire recorded history, cultural practices, and philosophical foundations that emphasize spiritual development and consciousness, cultivation as primary life purposes, rather than secondary activities that complement other forms of achievement or social contribution. Their society's complete integration of airbending with every aspect of daily existence suggests that elemental ability serves as more than simple skill or talent, functioning instead as fundamental expression of identity and spiritual attainment that defines membership within their community, while enabling participation in activities that would be impossible without such capabilities. The architectural evidence of air nomad civilization reinforces the universal nature of airbending within their population. Their temples and living spaces designed according to principles that assume aerial mobility and three-dimensional navigation as normal human capabilities, rather than exceptional gifts requiring special accommodation or alternative access methods. The vertical orientation of their constructions, the placement of essential facilities at heights reachable only through airbending, and the absence of conventional stairs or ramps in many critical areas demonstrate community planning that could not function if any significant portion of their population lacked the ability to fly and maneuver through pairs, three-dimensional spaces with precision and confidence. The spiritual practices that formed the foundation of air nomad culture required levels of detachment from material concerns and harmony with atmospheric forces that appear to create psychological and physiological conditions conducive to airbending development, while making alternative approaches to spiritual fulfillment less accessible or attractive to individuals whose consciousness remains focused upon earthbound concerns and conventional relationships with physical environment. Their meditation techniques, dietary restrictions, and social organization all emphasized cultivation of lightness, both physical and spiritual, that enabled transcendence of normal human limitations, while fostering the kind of consciousness that naturally expresses itself through manipulation of air and achievement of flight. The dietary implications of air nomad vegetarianism suggest nutritional and metabolic factors that might influence spiritual development and elemental affinity in ways that extend beyond ethical considerations to encompass physiological preparation for consciousness states that enable bending abilities to manifest and develop. Their plant-based nutrition created body chemistry that remained free from the density and heaviness associated with meat consumption, while providing the kind of energetic lightness that supports aerial activities and the subtle awareness required for perceiving and manipulating atmospheric currents that remain invisible to normal sensory capabilities. The question of what would happen to a hypothetical non-bender born into air nomad society reveals gaps in our understanding of how their culture would accommodate individuals whose spiritual development followed different patterns or whose consciousness expressed itself through capabilities other than elemental manipulation. The absence of historical precedent for such situations suggests either that their spiritual practices created conditions where airbending development became inevitable for all individuals raised within their cultural context, or that alternative forms of spiritual achievement were not recognized or recorded by observers whose attention focused primarily upon the bending abilities that made air nomads unique among the four nations. The practical challenges that a non-bender would face within air nomad architectural environments designed for aerial navigation present immediate survival concerns that would require community support and alternative access methods for participating in activities essential to daily life and spiritual development. The isolation that such circumstances might create could either motivate intensive spiritual practice aimed at developing latent airbending abilities, or result in psychological trauma and social exclusion that would make normal childhood, development and identity formation extremely difficult under circumstances where individual limitations prevent participation in activities that define community membership and cultural identity. The possibility that non-bending air nomads might develop alternative spiritual gifts that complement rather than replicate airbending abilities offers hope that such individuals could contribute meaningfully to community welfare while finding personal fulfillment through paths that honor their unique capabilities and spiritual inclinations. The healing arts, scholarly pursuits, artistic expression, or specialized forms of meditation and consciousness development might provide avenues for spiritual achievement that do not require elemental manipulation while serving community needs that even accomplished airbenders cannot address through their elemental abilities alone. The transportation solutions that would enable non-bending air nomads to participate in inter-temple travel and cultural exchange reveal additional dimensions of how their society might accommodate individuals whose spiritual gifts manifest through capabilities other than flight and aerial maneuvering. The development of specialized equipment, alternative travel methods, or partnerships with airbending community members could preserve access to experiences and relationships essential for spiritual development, while demonstrating community commitment to supporting all individuals, regardless of their specific capabilities or limitations. The historical precedent of Jasa, Avatar Kyoshi's mother, provides some insight into how air nomad society might respond to individuals whose spiritual development departs from conventional patterns, her departure from traditional community life, suggesting that alternative paths were possible, but might require abandoning the cultural context that had shaped her early development. Her decision to join the flying opera company and pursue a life of crime represents extreme adaptation to circumstances where her diminished airbending abilities made traditional air nomad existence difficult, while her skills remained valuable in contexts where perfect elemental mastery was less crucial for survival and success. The gradual diminishment of Jessa's airbending abilities following her departure from air nomad society suggests that their cultural practices and spiritual environment play crucial roles in maintaining and developing elemental capabilities throughout individuals' lifetimes rather than simply enabling initial manifestation during childhood development. The connection between spiritual practice, community support, and sustained elemental ability implies that airbending represents ongoing achievement rather than permanent acquisition, requiring continued cultivation and appropriate environmental conditions to maintain effectiveness and prevent deterioration through neglect or misuse. The weapons that Jaisa developed to compensate for her weakened airbending demonstrate adaptive strategies that individuals with diminished elemental abilities might employ to maintain effectiveness in situations where such capabilities provide significant advantages for survival and achievement. Her golden fans enabled her to focus and direct weakened air currents while providing physical tools that extended her reach and enhanced her combat effectiveness, despite limitations that would have been crippling in contexts requiring full airbending mastery and complete aerial mobility. The spiritual factors that appear to determine airbending potential within air nomad populations suggest that non-bending children might represent spiritual development that expresses itself through different channels rather than absence of elemental capability entirely. The consciousness cultivation that forms the foundation of air nomad education might enable such individuals to achieve spiritual insights and capabilities that complement community needs while providing personal fulfillment through paths that honor their unique gifts and spiritual inclinations, without requiring them to achieve identical outcomes through identical methods. The environmental influences that appear to support airbending development within air nomad territories include not just physical factors like altitude and atmospheric conditions, but spiritual energies that accumulate through generations of meditation and conscious cultivation of harmony with aerial forces. The temple locations chosen by ancient air nomads might have been selected for spiritual properties that support airbending development while creating atmospheric conditions where such abilities remain strongest and most easily maintained through daily practice and community reinforcement. The social implications of universal airbending within air nomad society extend beyond practical considerations to encompass identity, formation, and cultural belonging that might become problematic for individuals whose spiritual development follows alternative patterns despite their birth and upbringing within community contexts that assume elemental capability as fundamental aspect of normal human development and spiritual achievement. The psychological challenges of feeling excluded from activities that define community membership could create developmental difficulties that require specialized support and alternative forms of validation and achievement recognition. The educational approaches that air nomads developed for cultivating airbending abilities in children might prove adaptable for supporting non-bending individuals through alternative forms of spiritual development that honor their unique capabilities while providing access to community wisdom and cultural traditions through methods that do not depend upon elemental manipulation for effectiveness or participation. The meditation techniques, philosophical instruction, and consciousness cultivation practices that support airbending development might serve broader spiritual development goals that enable meaningful community participation, regardless of specific elemental capabilities. The post-harmonic convergence period that brought new airbenders into existence through spiritual transformation rather than genetic inheritance demonstrates that airbending potential might exist within broader human populations, despite remaining dormant under normal circumstances, suggesting that air nomad societies' universal bending resulted from cultural and spiritual conditions that enabled manifestation of capabilities that exist as latent potential within human consciousness, generally, rather than exclusive. Genetic inheritance that distinguishes their population from other groups. The integration challenges that new airbenders face when attempting to adapt to air nomad cultural practices and spiritual disciplines reveal how much community support and cultural context contribute to successful development of elemental abilities, their difficulties suggesting that isolated individuals or those lacking appropriate guidance might struggle to develop capabilities that come naturally within supportive community environments that provide proper instruction, encouragement, and practical applications that make elemental mastery meaningful rather than merely theoretical or recreational. As we drift deeper into contemplation of these mysteries surrounding spiritual inheritance and the relationship between consciousness and elemental capabilities, we begin to understand that the question of non-bending air nomads illuminates broader themes about diversity within unity, alternative expressions of spiritual development, and the ways that communities can honor individual differences while maintaining cultural coherence and shared commitment to values that transcend specific capabilities or achievements, creating space for all consciousness to flourish according to its unique nature, while contributing to collective welfare and spiritual evolution. The networks of influence that operate beneath the surface of recorded history have shaped the course of civilizations and the destiny of nations through methods so subtle and objectives, so long-term that their very existence challenges conventional understanding of how power moves through human societies and political institutions. Among these shadow organizations, the Order of the White Lotus stands as perhaps the most documented yet simultaneously mysterious example of how dedicated individuals can preserve wisdom and facilitate change across generations while maintaining secrecy that protects both their members and their accumulated knowledge from those who would exploit such resources for destructive rather than constructive purposes. The origins of the White Lotus stretch back through centuries of political upheaval and social transformation that tested humanity's capacity for maintaining wisdom traditions and scholarly cooperation despite the boundaries that warfare and nationalism created between populations that shared fundamental interests in knowledge preservation and spiritual development. The founding principles that guided their early development emphasized transcendence of political loyalty in favor of dedication to universal truths that served all humanity rather than advancing the interests of particular nations or rulers whose temporary authority could never justify abandoning eternal principles of wisdom and compassion. The selection criteria that determined White Lotus membership operated according to standards that prioritized character and wisdom over social position or political influence, their recruitment focusing upon individuals whose demonstrated commitment to learning and service indicated reliability that could withstand the pressures and temptations that secret knowledge and hidden influence inevitably created. The evaluation processes that preceded admission to their ranks required evidence of spiritual development and moral integrity that could not be faked through superficial performance or temporary behavioral modification designed to gain access to restricted information and privileged relationships. The geographical distribution of White Lotus members across all 4 nations during periods of intense conflict and mutual suspicion demonstrates organizational sophistication that enabled communication and coordination despite travel, restrictions, and cultural barriers that made normal scholarly exchange difficult or impossible through conventional channels. Their ability to maintain unified purpose while operating within societies that viewed each other as enemies required communication methods and identification systems that could function under surveillance, while providing verification of membership and authority that prevented infiltration by hostile intelligence services or opportunistic individuals seeking personal advantage. The gradual reveal of White Lotus membership among characters who had previously been known primarily for their individual achievements and national loyalties suggests recruitment strategies that identified and cultivated individuals whose potential for wisdom and service might not be immediately obvious to casual observers, but whose character and capabilities made them valuable additions to an organization dedicated to serving universal rather than particular interests. The surprise that accompanied each revelation reflects how successfully members maintained their cover identities while fulfilling both their public roles and their secret responsibilities to the Order's larger purposes. Iroh's position as Grand Lotus provides insight into the leadership structure that enabled White Lotus coordination across vast distances and diverse cultural contexts, while maintaining security that protected both individual members and organizational objectives from discovery by hostile forces that would have viewed such cooperation as treason against national interests and legitimate grounds for persecution or elimination. His transformation from Fire Nation General to wise spiritual guide parallels the kind of consciousness development that White Lotus membership both required and facilitated through access to wisdom traditions and collaborative relationships that transcended normal social and political limitations. The timing of White Lotus involvement in Avatar Aang's mission suggests that their decision to emerge from secrecy was coordinated with broader strategic objectives that required abandoning generations of careful concealment in favor of direct action when circumstances demanded immediate intervention that only their combined capabilities and coordinated effort could provide effectively. Their willingness to risk exposure and potential destruction demonstrates commitment to serving the greater good that superseded organizational self-preservation when fundamental principles were at stake. The liberation of Ba Sing Se that marked White Lotus' transition from secret society to active military force required capabilities that extended far beyond individual bending abilities to encompass strategic planning, resource coordination, and tactical execution that drew upon decades of preparation and intelligence gathering that had remained hidden until circumstances made revelation necessary for achieving objectives that no other organization possessed the knowledge and capabilities to accomplish successfully under the extreme time constraints that Sozin's Comet imposed upon all resistance efforts. The post-war role that White Lotus assumed in protecting and training the Avatar represents evolution from knowledge preservation to active guardianship that reflects changing circumstances and organizational adaptation to serve needs that peacetime created while maintaining essential functions that had justified their existence during periods when secret operation provided more effective service than public recognition and institutional authority. Their willingness to accept official status demonstrates confidence that their principles and methods could withstand scrutiny while providing transparency that builds trust rather than continuing secrecy that might generate suspicion. The recruitment of new members during the post-war period would have required modification of selection criteria and training methods that had been developed for operating under conditions of political oppression and cultural conflict. Their peacetime operations, demanding different skills and approaches, while maintaining core principles that distinguished White Lotus membership from conventional political or scholarly organizations. The balance between preserving traditional wisdom and adapting to contemporary circumstances would have challenged leadership to maintain organizational coherence while enabling growth and development that served evolving needs. The potential for other secret societies that might have developed parallel to White Lotus operations presents possibilities for discovering additional networks of influence and knowledge preservation that remained hidden even from organizations whose own secrecy was so complete that decades passed before their existence became known to those they had been protecting and serving. The scholarly traditions and wisdom preservation that motivated White Lotus formation might have inspired similar organizations with different geographical focus, cultural specialization, or operational methods that served complementary functions while maintaining complete independence and mutual ignorance. The spiritual dimensions that appear to have influenced White Lotus development suggest connections to wisdom traditions and consciousness practices that extend beyond conventional academic study or political organization to encompass genuine spiritual development and cosmic perspective that enabled members to maintain long-term vision and ethical behavior, despite the pressures and temptations that secret power and hidden influence inevitably create. Their dedication to serving universal rather than particular interests reflects spiritual maturity that distinguishes authentic wisdom traditions from organizations whose secrecy serves self-interest rather than collective welfare. The relationship between White Lotus principles and the Avatar's cosmic responsibilities demonstrates alignment of objectives that suggests either deliberate coordination or natural harmony between different approaches to serving, balance, and protecting wisdom that sustains civilization during periods of crisis and transformation. Their emergence as Avatar supporters rather than independent agents indicates recognition that their organizational capabilities could best serve universal welfare through collaboration with Avatar power rather than through separate action that might conflict with or undermine cosmic authority and spiritual guidance. The knowledge preservation that formed White Lotus' core mission during centuries of political instability and cultural conflict created repositories of wisdom that survived wars and social upheavals that destroyed libraries, universities, and educational institutions, whose loss might otherwise have created dark ages where human knowledge regressed, rather than advancing toward greater understanding and capability. Their success in maintaining and transmitting crucial information demonstrates organizational resilience and member dedication that enabled continuity across generations, while adapting methods and priorities to changing circumstances. The identification systems that enabled White Lotus members to recognize each other despite operating within hostile environments and maintaining cover identities that precluded normal forms of communication suggest sophisticated development of codes, symbols, and behavioral signals that could convey complex information while remaining invisible to surveillance and interpretation by those lacking proper knowledge and authority. The pie show games that served as contact method represent integration of recognition systems with normal social activities that provided cover for clandestine meetings while enabling strategy discussions through symbolic gameplay. The training methods that White Lotus employed to develop member capabilities would have required balancing skill development with security concerns, providing education and preparation that enhanced individual effectiveness while maintaining compartmentalization that protected organizational secrets and member safety from discovery through interrogation or infiltration attempts by hostile intelligence services. The combination of martial arts, scholarly study, and spiritual development that characterized known members suggests comprehensive education that created individuals capable of serving diverse roles while maintaining unified commitment to organizational principles. The financial resources that enabled White Lotus operations across multiple nations and extended time periods indicate either independent wealth generation through member contributions and business activities, or support from wealthy patrons who shared their objectives while providing material backing that enabled communication, travel, and operational expenses that secret societies inevitably require. The scale of their final military operations suggests access to significant resources that had been accumulated and preserved despite decades of secrecy and political uncertainty. The post-war transformation of White Lotus from secret society to official organization responsible for avatar protection represents fundamental change in operational methods and organizational culture that might have created tensions between older members accustomed to secrecy and newer recruits whose experience with public service and institutional responsibility differed dramatically from traditional approaches that had sustained the organization through centuries of hidden operation and careful concealment of activities and objectives. As we contemplate the mysteries that still surround these shadow networks and their influence upon historical events that shaped our world, we begin to understand that the most profound changes in human civilization often emerge not from dramatic confrontations or public movements, but from patient work of dedicated individuals whose wisdom and commitment enable them to serve universal principles across generations. Their hidden efforts creating foundations for peace and progress that more visible forms of leadership could never achieve through force or political maneuvering alone, demonstrating how consciousness, development, and spiritual dedication can transform the world through service that seeks no recognition while accomplishing goals that seem impossible to those who lack vision, adequate for perceiving the dainty, eternal patterns that connect individual choices with cosmic purposes. The wounds that war inflicts upon human consciousness extend far beyond the physical scars that mark individual bodies and devastated landscapes, creating psychological and spiritual damage that propagates through generations like ripples, spreading across still water disturbed by stones thrown with violent force. These invisible injuries shape the thoughts, behaviors, and relationships of people who never experience direct combat, while influencing social institutions and cultural practices in ways that perpetuate cycles of trauma and healing across decades of apparent peace that cannot erase memories embedded in collective consciousness through suffering too profound for conventional recovery methods to address completely. The systematic campaign of terror that Azula orchestrated throughout her brief but devastating career as Fire Nation weapon and political manipulator created psychological damage that extended far beyond her immediate victims to encompass entire communities whose sense of security and trust in basic human decency was shattered by exposure to cruelty that seemed to emerge from intelligence and strategic thinking rather than simple emotional instability or temporary loss of control. Her methodical approach to causing maximum psychological harm demonstrated understanding of human vulnerability that she weaponized with surgical precision while maintaining facade of rational behavior that made her unpredictability more terrifying than conventional forms of violence. The princess, whose childhood had been shaped by imperial expectations and parental dysfunction, became living embodiment of how war corrupts consciousness at its most fundamental levels, her development into instrument of systematic cruelty, revealing how societies that glorify conquest and domination inevitably produce individuals whose personalities become organized around, causing suffering, while their intelligence and charisma enable them to inspire loyalty, even among those whose welfare they consistently sacrifice for personal advancement and psychological gratification derived from exercising power over others without restraint or accountability. The lasting influence that Azula continues to exert through the networks of supporters and imitators who absorbed her methods and philosophy demonstrates how individual evil can create institutional momentum that persists long after its original source has been removed from positions of direct authority and immediate influence. The Fire Warriors, who embraced her vision of restored Fire Nation supremacy, represent ideological transmission that operates through psychological and spiritual mechanisms rather than formal political organization. Their dedication to her memory and methods creating ongoing threats to stability and social healing that conventional law enforcement cannot address through normal investigative and arrest procedures. The children who witnessed Azula's psychological warfare techniques or experienced her manipulation directly carry memories and behavioral patterns that influence their own approaches to conflict resolution and interpersonal relationships throughout their adult lives, creating ripple effects that extend her influence across generations through unconscious transmission of trauma responses and maladaptive coping strategies that shape how they interact with authority figures, resolve disputes, and understand the balance between personal needs and social responsibility that healthy communities require for sustained cooperation and mutual support. The systematic nature of Fire Nation war crimes during the century of expansion created cultural normalization of violence and dehumanization that required more than simple policy changes to address effectively the attitudes and assumptions that had enabled ordinary citizens to support or ignore systematic oppression and cultural destruction, continuing to influence social relationships and political decisions during Reconstruction periods when official policies promoted cooperation and reconciliation, while deeper psychological patterns remained unexamined and unhealed through processes adequate for genuine transformation. The intergenerational transmission of trauma that occurs when parents who experienced war's violence raise children during peacetime creates complex dynamics where protective instincts and survival strategies that once served essential functions become obstacles to normal childhood development and healthy social integration. The hypervigilance, emotional detachment, and difficulty trusting others that enable survival under dangerous conditions can become parenting patterns that teach children to view the world as fundamentally threatening while limiting their capacity for forming secure attachments and developing optimistic expectations about human nature and social cooperation. The economic disruption that war creates through destruction of infrastructure, displacement of populations, and militarization of resource allocation continues to influence social stability and individual opportunity long after combat operations cease. The poverty and inequality that result from such disruption, creating conditions where desperation and competition make cooperation difficult, while resentment over unequal recovery creates political tensions that opportunistic leaders can exploit to promote renewed conflict rather than sustained efforts toward healing and reconciliation between former enemies. The destruction of cultural institutions and knowledge systems that occurs during systematic campaigns of conquest and cultural suppression creates gaps in community wisdom and traditional practices that leave populations vulnerable to manipulation and unable to draw upon inherited resources for processing trauma and maintaining social cohesion during periods of stress and uncertainty. The loss of elders, teachers, and cultural practitioners who would normally guide communities through crisis periods creates leadership vacuums that inexperienced individuals must attempt to fill without adequate preparation or traditional support systems. The psychological mechanisms that enable ordinary people to participate in or support systematic violence against civilian populations create moral injuries that persist long after political circumstances change. The knowledge of having contributed to unnecessary suffering generating guilt and shame that individuals struggle to process, while communities must decide how to address accountability and forgiveness in ways that serve justice without perpetuating cycles of retribution that prevent genuine healing and social reconstruction from proceeding successfully. The challenge of maintaining hope and optimism during extended periods of conflict creates spiritual exhaustion that affects entire populations, whose capacity for believing in positive change becomes depleted through repeated disappointment and exposure to evidence that human nature includes potential for extraordinary cruelty, as well as remarkable compassion. The cynicism and despair that develop as protective mechanisms against further disappointment can become self-perpetuating patterns that resist efforts to restore faith in human goodness and social progress, even when circumstances improve substantially. The question of redemption and forgiveness that emerges during post-conflict periods creates moral dilemmas that test community values and individual character, while requiring decisions about how much mercy serves justice and when accountability becomes necessary for preventing repetition of past mistakes and protecting vulnerable populations from those whose behavior during wartime suggests ongoing danger to social stability and individual safety. The balance between rehabilitation and punishment remains contentious because both approaches serve legitimate purposes, while neither alone provides complete solutions to complex problems of justice and community healing. The children born during wartime who grow up surrounded by violence and uncertainty develop coping mechanisms and worldviews that may prove maladaptive during peacetime, when different skills and attitudes become necessary for success and build happiness in environments that operate according to cooperative rather than competitive principles. Their adjustment to peaceful conditions requires unlearning survival strategies that once protected them while developing trust and vulnerability that peace makes possible, but war teaches people to avoid as dangerous weaknesses that enemies can exploit. The veterans who return from combat with physical and psychological injuries that, invisible to casual observation, struggle with reintegration into civilian communities whose members cannot understand their experiences while lacking resources and support systems adequate for addressing trauma that conventional medicine and social services were never designed to handle effectively. Their isolation and difficulty maintaining relationships creates ongoing suffering that affects not only former combatants, but their families and communities, whose capacity for providing support may be limited by their own trauma, resource constraints. The institutional memory that develops within military and governmental organizations during extended conflicts creates bureaucratic momentum that continues to influence policy decisions and resource allocation long after the conditions that originally justified such approaches have changed substantially. The mindset and procedures that enable effective wartime governance may become obstacles to peaceful development when flexibility and cooperation become more important than discipline and hierarchy for achieving social objectives that serve long-term welfare rather than short-term survival needs. The environmental destruction that modern warfare creates through industrial-scale violence and resource exploitation generates ecological trauma that affects all living systems while requiring generations of patient restoration work to repair damage that was accomplished in brief periods of intensive destruction. The poisoned waters, salted fields, and devastated forests that remain as war's physical legacy continue to influence community health and economic opportunity, while serving as constant reminders of destruction's ease compared to creation's difficulty and time requirements. The spiritual dimension of war's aftermath involves questions about meaning and purpose that challenge religious and philosophical frameworks that may prove inadequate for explaining suffering on the scale that modern conflicts create, while providing comfort and guidance for individuals whose faith in cosmic justice and human worth has been tested by exposure to unnecessary cruelty and systematic destruction of everything beautiful and sacred that gives life meaning beyond mere biological survival and material accumulation. The process of rebuilding social trust and cooperative institutions requires acknowledging past injuries while creating new relationships that transcend historical grievances and competitive dynamics that contributed to original conflicts, demanding emotional maturity and spiritual development that enable forgiveness without forgetting lessons that must be preserved to prevent repetition of mistakes that caused tremendous suffering to innocent people whose only crime was existing in proximity to political disputes and resource. Competitions that escalated beyond rational resolution through peaceful negotiation. As we drift deeper into contemplation of these lasting wounds and the slow process of healing that spans generations of patient work by individuals committed to creating better futures despite their inheritance of trauma and loss, we begin to understand that peace represents not simple absence of active conflict, but positive presence of institutions, relationships, and cultural practices that serve healing, while building resilience against forces that will inevitably test human commitment to cooperation over competition, compassion over cruelty, and hope over despair in the eternal struggle between consciousness that creates and consciousness that destroys the precious bonds that make civilization possible. The moral contradictions that emerge from careful examination of Avatar Aang's choices throughout his journey reveal philosophical tensions so profound that they challenge fundamental assumptions about ethical consistency, the nature of justice, and the relationship between individual conscience and cosmic responsibility that defines Avatar duty across lifetimes of service to balance and harmony. These paradoxes illuminate broader questions about how spiritual development relates to moral decision-making, while demonstrating that even the most compassionate and well-intentioned individuals face situations where different ethical principles conflict in ways that make perfect consistency impossible without abandoning core values that give life meaning and purpose. The most striking contradiction in Aang's moral framework emerges from his simultaneous commitment to preserving all life while participating in combat situations that inevitably result in casualties among opponents whose deaths he never directly acknowledges or mourns, despite his philosophical dedication to recognizing the sacred nature of every consciousness and the interconnectedness of all existence. His destruction of Fire Nation airships during various battles killed hundreds of soldiers whose names he never learned and whose families he never considered. Yet, these deaths apparently created no internal conflict with his absolute refusal to execute Fire Lord Ozai under circumstances where such action might have prevented greater suffering. The distinction between direct and indirect killing that seems to operate within Aang's moral reasoning reflects psychological mechanisms that enable most people to participate in harmful systems while maintaining positive self-image and moral identity. But such compartmentalization appears inconsistent with the spiritual awareness and cosmic perspective that Avatar training is supposed to develop through connection with past incarnations and universal principles that transcend normal human limitations and cultural conditioning. The Avatar state that grants access to accumulated wisdom from centuries of moral experience should theoretically provide clarity about ethical issues that confuse ordinary consciousness. The spiritual significance that Aang assigns to personal execution of Ozai compared to his casual acceptance of battlefield casualties, suggests moral reasoning that prioritizes symbolic purity over practical consequences. His concern for maintaining personal innocence, taking precedence over minimizing actual harm to sentient beings whose suffering should matter equally, regardless of whether their deaths result from deliberate individual action or participation in larger systems of violence that distribute responsibility among multiple participants, while obscuring individual accountability through institutional structures and group dynamics. The energy-bending solution that ultimately resolved Aang's moral dilemma appears to validate his refusal to compromise his principles, but the technique's application required spiritual authority and moral certainty that seemed incompatible with the psychological compartmentalization that had enabled him to participate in lethal combat throughout his Avatar journey. The perfect confidence in his own righteousness that energy bending demanded contradicts the humility and self-doubt that would naturally accompany genuine recognition of his previous moral inconsistencies and participation in violence that violated his stated commitment to preserving all life. The cultural dimensions of Avatar moral reasoning reveal how individual backgrounds continue to influence cosmic perspectives, despite access to accumulated wisdom from incarnations raised in completely different societies, with contrasting values and ethical frameworks. Aang's air nomad upbringing emphasized harmony and non-violence in ways that shaped his approach to conflict resolution throughout his life. While previous avatars like Kyoshi and Roku demonstrated willingness to use lethal force when they judged such action necessary for preventing greater harm or maintaining social order that served long-term peace and justice, the philosophical tension between Aang's individual conscience and his inherited avatar responsibilities created internal conflict that might have been resolved through deeper exploration of how different cultural approaches to morality could complement rather than contradict each other when applied with wisdom and appropriate consideration for specific circumstances and long-term consequences. The Avatar state's access to multiple perspectives on ethical issues should theoretically enable synthesis of different moral frameworks rather than creating confusion about which principles should take precedence when they conflict. The question of whether Avatar moral authority derives from cosmic connection or individual wisdom becomes crucial when examining situations where different ethical systems provide conflicting guidance about appropriate action under specific circumstances. If Avatar judgment represents universal principles that transcend cultural limitation and personal preference, then consistency across different incarnations should be expected despite their varied backgrounds and personality traits. However, if Avatar wisdom emerges from individual consciousness enhanced by spiritual connection and accumulated experience, then variation in moral approaches might reflect appropriate adaptation to changing circumstances rather than philosophical confusion. The burden of making decisions that affect entire civilizations creates moral pressure that exceeds normal human capacity for ethical reasoning while requiring choices under time constraints and information limitations that make careful, philosophical analysis impossible, despite the magnitude of consequences that will result from whatever action is taken or avoided. The Avatar who hesitates while contemplating perfect solutions may allow preventable suffering to occur through inaction, while the Avatar who acts decisively without adequate reflection may cause harm that could have been avoided through more patient consideration of alternatives. The relationship between mercy and justice that complicates many Avatar decisions reflects broader tensions within ethical systems that must balance compassion for individual suffering with responsibility for maintaining social order and protecting innocent people from those whose behavior threatens community welfare and personal safety, the forgiveness that enables healing and reconciliation may also enable repetition of harmful behavior when extended to individuals whose character and intentions suggest ongoing danger to others who deserve protection from preventable violence and exploitation. The avatar state that channels collective wisdom from past incarnations sometimes provides guidance that conflicts with individual moral intuition, creating situations where cosmic authority and personal conscience point toward different courses of action, while time pressure and political circumstances make extended deliberation impossible. The avatar who follows inherited wisdom may violate personal values that provide psychological stability and spiritual grounding, while the avatar who trusts individual judgment may ignore accumulated experience and universal principles that transcend personal limitation and cultural conditioning. The cycles of violence that avatar intervention is meant to break often require temporary participation in harmful systems to prevent greater destruction while creating moral injury that affects individual avatar psychology and spiritual development in ways that may impair future decision-making and emotional stability. The avatar who remains completely pure while civilizations collapse around them fails to fulfill cosmic responsibilities, while the avatar who becomes too comfortable with necessary violence may lose the compassion and restraint that make their power beneficial rather than dangerous to those they serve. The legacy that each avatar creates through their moral choices influences not only immediate political and social outcomes, but the spiritual inheritance available to future incarnations who must build upon previous decisions while adapting to circumstances that may require different approaches to similar ethical challenges. The avatar who establishes precedents for flexible moral reasoning provides future incarnations with tools for adaptation, while the avatar who demonstrates rigid adherence to specific principles may create expectations that prove inadequate for addressing novel challenges. The question of whether moral perfection is possible or desirable for beings who must operate within imperfect systems and make decisions under impossible circumstances, who reveals fundamental tensions between idealistic ethical frameworks, practical necessities that govern real-world applications of moral principles. The avatar who demands perfect consistency may become paralyzed by philosophical complexity, while the avatar who accepts necessary compromise may gradually abandon principles that provide essential guidance for distinguishing beneficial action from harmful self-deception and rationalization. The psychological toll that moral contradiction creates through accumulated guilt and spiritual confusion may impair avatar effectiveness while generating emotional instability that affects personal relationships and decision-making capacity under pressure. The individual who recognizes their moral inconsistencies must either develop more sophisticated ethical frameworks that accommodate complexity without abandoning core values, or risk psychological fragmentation that makes consistent moral reasoning impossible under circumstances that demand clear judgment and decisive action. The spiritual dimensions of avatar morality suggest that ethical development continues across incarnations through exposure to different cultural frameworks and practical challenges that test philosophical assumptions while providing opportunities for growth and refinement that individual lifetimes could never accomplish alone. The accumulated moral wisdom of past incarnations represents resource for addressing contemporary challenges while creating responsibility for contributing new insights and refined approaches that serve future incarnations facing circumstances that previous avatars never encountered. As we contemplate these profound paradoxes that emerge when cosmic responsibility encounters individual conscience within imperfect systems that require navigation between competing moral demands, we begin to understand that perhaps the greatest wisdom lies not in achieving perfect consistency, but in maintaining commitment to growth and learning, while accepting the tragic reality that serving the greater good sometimes requires choices that violate personal ideals, and that moral development involves not the elimination of ethical complexity, but the cultivation of wisdom, adequate for making decisions that honor the deepest values, while accepting responsibility for consequences that extend far beyond individual comprehension or control. The forgotten heroes whose names never entered official chronicles or historical records represent the vast majority of individuals whose quiet courage and daily dedication enabled civilization to survive the century of war, while maintaining the essential human connections and cultural practices that make peace possible when political circumstances finally allow cooperation to replace conflict as the primary organizing principle of international relations. These unnamed individuals carried forward traditions, preserved knowledge, and provided care that sustained communities through their darkest periods, while receiving no recognition beyond the gratitude of those whose lives they directly touched through service that sought no reward except the satisfaction of contributing to something larger than personal survival or advancement. Among these humble heroes, the cabbage merchant stands as perhaps the most visible example of how ordinary people adapted to extraordinary circumstances while maintaining dignity and hope, despite repeated setbacks that would have defeated less resilient spirits. His persistence in rebuilding his livelihood after each encounter with Team Avatar's chaotic adventures demonstrates the kind of determination that characterized countless individuals who refused to abandon their commitments to family and community, despite war's tendency to destroy everything that makes life meaningful rather than merely survivable under conditions that test human endurance and faith in better possibilities. The mystery surrounding the cabbage merchant's true identity and background reveals how much we overlook about the people whose daily work and quiet persistence provide the foundation upon which larger historical events unfold, their individual stories remaining untold, while their collective contribution enables the dramatic achievements that capture attention and inspire legends. His transition from street vendor to restaurant owner and eventually industrial pioneer suggests capabilities and resources that remained hidden beneath his humble exterior, while his consistent good humor despite repeated disasters indicates character that found strength through sources invisible to casual observation. The vegetables that provided the cabbage merchant's livelihood connect him to agricultural networks and farming communities, whose continued production throughout the war period required courage and dedication that urban populations rarely considered while enjoying access to food that someone had risked their lives to grow, harvest, and transport. Despite military operations that targeted civilian infrastructure and supply lines as legitimate weapons of war, the farmers who maintained their fields despite Fire Nation raids deserved recognition equal to any battlefield hero for their contribution to survival and hope. The supply chains that enabled merchants like him to obtain and distribute necessities throughout war-torn regions required cooperation between individuals whose political loyalties might have made them enemies under different frames, circumstances, their shared commitment to serving basic human needs, creating connections that transcended national boundaries and ideological differences. The networks of trust and mutual support that sustained commerce during periods of intense conflict demonstrated how economic relationships could bridge divisions that political and military systems seemed determined to maintain and exploit. The customers who supported small merchants despite economic hardship and uncertain circumstances made conscious choices to prioritize local relationships and community stability over convenience or cost savings that might have been available through alternatives. Their loyalty representing investment in social bonds that proved more valuable than immediate material advantage. When circumstances tested community resilience and mutual support systems that sustained morale and practical cooperation during crisis periods, the innovations that enabled individuals to adapt traditional livelihoods to wartime conditions required creativity and flexibility that transformed ordinary occupations into forms of resistance against forces that sought to destroy normal life and social connections. Through systematic disruption of economic relationships and cultural practices that provided stability and meaning independent of political authority or military control. The merchants who continued operating despite harassment and interference maintained spaces where normal human interactions could occur despite abnormal external circumstances. The humor that characterized many individuals' responses to repeated setbacks and frustrations demonstrates psychological resilience that enabled communities to maintain hope and social cohesion despite exposure to violence and uncertainty that could have destroyed morale and cooperative spirit if not balanced by cultural resources that enabled people to find reasons for laughter, even under conditions that provided abundant justification for despair and cynicism about human nature and social progress. The children who grew up during the war period, surrounded by examples of ordinary heroism, learned lessons about character and responsibility that prepared them to build better societies during peacetime. Their understanding of how communities survive crisis through mutual support and shared commitment to values that transcend immediate self-interest, providing foundation for reconstruction efforts that required cooperation across cultural and political boundaries that had been militarized and hardened through generations of conflict. The women who maintained households and raised families, while men fought in distant battles or worked in support industries, demonstrated management skills and emotional strength that kept communities functioning despite resource shortages and constant anxiety about family members whose safety remained uncertain for months or years at a time. Their ability to create stability and nurture hope under such conditions required capabilities that military training never addressed, while providing services that formal institutions could never replace. The elderly individuals who preserved cultural knowledge and traditional practices, despite social upheaval that displaced populations and disrupted intergenerational transmission of wisdom, served as living libraries whose memories contained information about how communities had solved problems and maintained values during previous periods of difficulty and uncertainty. Their stories and guidance provided resources for adaptation that written records and formal education could never capture completely or transmit as effectively as personal relationship and direct experience. The healers who treated injuries and illnesses despite shortages of medical supplies and formal training used whatever resources remained available, while developing innovative techniques that saved lives under conditions where conventional medicine would have been helpless to provide adequate care. For the volume and severity of casualties that war inevitably creates among civilian populations as well as military forces. Their combination of traditional knowledge and creative adaptation enabled communities to survive medical crises that could have caused social collapse. The teachers who continued educational activities despite disruption of formal school systems and recruitment of young people for military service maintained intellectual development and cultural transmission that prevented entire generations from losing access to literacy mathematics, and critical thinking skills that peaceful societies require for effective governance and economic development. Their commitment to learning, despite immediate pressures to focus entirely upon survival needs, represented investment in future possibilities that seemed impossibly remote during the darkest periods. The artisans whose craftsmanship provided beauty and cultural continuity, despite economic pressures that made survival concerns seem more important than aesthetic values, demonstrated understanding that human well-being requires more than material security, that dignity and hope depend upon access to beauty and creative expression that connects individuals to cultural heritage, while providing meaning that transcends immediate circumstances and temporary hardships that could be endured, if balanced by experiences that affirmed life's value beyond mere biological continuation. The religious and spiritual leaders who maintained practices and provided comfort despite persecution and social disruption offered resources for psychological resilience and moral guidance that enabled individuals to maintain ethical behavior despite exposure to violence and temptation that tested character, while providing meaning and hope that sustained motivation for enduring hardship and working toward better conditions for future generations, rather than abandoning idealism in favor of cynical acceptance of current limitations. The inventors and innovators who developed new solutions to practical problems created by wartime conditions used creativity and technical knowledge to improve living conditions and work efficiency under circumstances that conventional approaches could not address adequately, their contributions often remaining invisible to those who benefited from improved tools, techniques, and systems without understanding the intelligence and dedication required for such development under resource constraints and time pressures that made innovation both necessary and extremely difficult. The migrants and refugees who carried cultural knowledge and practices from their original homes to new communities created cultural exchange and cross-pollination that enriched receiving populations while preserving traditions that might otherwise have been lost when original communities were destroyed or dispersed by military action and political upheaval. Their adaptation to new environments while maintaining essential cultural identity provided models for integration that served both preservation and evolution of human civilization. The record keepers and chroniclers who maintained documentation despite dangers and difficulties of preserving written materials under conditions of constant movement and uncertain security created resources for future historians and policymakers, while ensuring that lessons learned through suffering and adaptation could be transmitted to generations who would face different but related challenges, requiring similar wisdom and determination to overcome obstacles that seem insurmountable without examples of previous success and guidance from those who had navigated similar difficulties. As we drift into deeper appreciation for these countless unnamed individuals whose quiet heroism enabled civilization to survive its darkest century while maintaining the essential human qualities that make peace meaningful rather than merely representing absence of active conflict, we begin to understand that history's greatest achievements emerge not from the dramatic actions of famous leaders, but from the accumulated daily choices of ordinary people who choose service over selfishness, hope over despair, and love over fear, despite circumstances that provide abundant justification for abandoning idealism in favor of narrow self-interest and immediate survival that ignores broader community needs and future possibilities. As we reach the end of our journey through these eternal mysteries that dance at the edges of understanding like morning mist over sacred mountains, Perhaps we discover that the most profound truth lies not in finding answers, but in embracing the wonder that unanswered questions create within our hearts and minds. Each mystery we have explored tonight represents an invitation to imagine, to dream, to consider possibilities that extend beyond the boundaries of what we think we know about consciousness, identity, and the infinite connections that bind all existence together in patterns, too vast and beautiful for any single perspective to encompass completely. The avatar world continues to live and breathe through these unsolved puzzles because mystery itself serves as the fertile soil from which imagination grows, creating space for new stories to emerge, while honoring the wisdom that recognizes some truths are too precious to be reduced to simple explanations or definitive conclusions. In the gentle uncertainty that surrounds these questions, we find reflection of our own lives' deepest mysteries about love, purpose, growth, and the eternal dance between what we understand and what remains forever, beyond our grasp, yet eternally present in our wonder. So as sleep calls you toward dreams where all mysteries resolve into the peace that surpasses understanding, carry with you the knowledge that questions themselves are gifts, that wonder is wisdom, and that the most beautiful truths often whisper their secrets not through answers, but through the quiet joy of contemplating infinite possibility, stretching like starlight across the vast darkness of everything we have yet to discover about ourselves and the miraculous world we share.